In the early hours of August 2nd, 1988, Karen Lane, just 32 years old, was brutally murdered in her apartment in Cordova, Alabama. Her body was found with 60 violent injuries, a brutal reminder of the rage that consumed her killer, Gregory Hunt. Their brief relationship ended in a fit of jealousy and violence. Hunt broke into her home, sexually assaulted her, and inflicted 60 brutal injuries that left her lifeless. What followed was a tragic tale of anger, betrayal, and crime so horrific it would haunt Lane's family for over 3 decades. Gregory Hunt was not a man with a clean record. Born in Florida, his life had been filled with struggles and personal failures. Having been married twice and moving frequently, Hunt's life seemed to be defined by instability. After his parents' divorce, he found himself in and out of foster care, struggling to find his place in the world. Despite these challenges, he eventually settled in Alabama, where he began a brief, volatile relationship with Karen Lane. Lane, a 32-year-old woman living in Cordova, Alabama, had recently ended a marriage and was trying to rebuild her life. She met Hunt, and what started as a short fling quickly turned into a relationship filled with warning signs. Although they had only been together for a month, Hunt's behavior began to show his darker tendencies. His jealousy soon became evident, and what should have been a brief relationship turned into something far more dangerous. Lane, unaware of Hunt's emotional instability, started to distance herself as his possessiveness grew, but this only fueled his resentment. Hunt's jealousy quickly morphed into an obsession. He couldn't accept the idea of losing control over the relationship. His actions became more erratic, and his mental state began to unravel. What began as a breakup for Lane turned into an emotional battleground for Hunt, one that he was determined to win at any cost. This was no longer just about the end of a relationship. It became about domination and revenge. Lane's rejection of him was a personal affront, and Hunt's inability to process this rejection in a healthy way turned his anger into something far more sinister. As the days passed, Hunt's obsession with Lane grew. When she tried to end things, he couldn't accept it. The feeling of losing control, of being cast aside, filled him with rage. His anger didn't just stem from hurt. It was about reclaiming what he felt was his. For Hunt, Lane's rejection wasn't just an emotional wound. It was a deep insult to his sense of self. This desire for control and his deep-seated anger would drive him to a point of no return. On the night of August 2nd, 1988, Hunt's jealousy and rage would spill over in the most violent way imaginable, leaving a young woman dead and a family shattered. On the night of August 2nd, 1988, a quiet evening in Cordova, Alabama was shattered by the actions of Gregory Hunt. His mind, clouded by growing jealousy and anger, drove him to take matters into his own hands. Lane had begun to distance herself from him, and in his eyes, that was a rejection he couldn't bear. The relationship, which had lasted barely a month, had ended, and Hunt's emotions erupted in violence. He couldn't accept her decision to move on. Around midnight, Hunt broke into Lane's apartment. As he forced the door open, the reality of what was to come set in. Lane, completely unaware, was suddenly faced with a man who was no longer the person she had once trusted, but a violent figure driven by emotions he could not control. Once inside, Hunt immediately attacked Lane, overpowering her in a moment of raw, unrestrained rage. He inflicted brutal injuries on her, but it wasn't just the physical assault that was terrifying. Hunt's state of mind during the attack showed a man who had already lost touch with any form of compassion or control. The violence wasn't just about hurting her. It was about punishing her for rejecting him. The force of his blows shattered Lane's body, leaving her unrecognizable. At some point, Hunt sexually assaulted Lane, further brutalizing her. This wasn't simply an act of rage anymore. It was the culmination of Hunt's need for control, his belief that he could dominate Lane in every way possible. The violence he used wasn't just about the physical act of hurting her, but about owning her, showing her that she could not escape him. The moment Lane tried to pull away, Hunt's anger pushed him to a point where nothing else mattered. He had already decided that she would pay for her rejection, no matter the cost. After the attack, Hunt left the apartment, But the horror wasn't over. He made a casual phone call, nonchalantly telling the boyfriend of one of Lane's friends to check on her. It was as if he had convinced himself that he could just walk away from the crime, as if the violence he had just committed could somehow be erased. "She's on the kitchen floor," Hunt said during the call, an attempt to make the situation seem insignificant, even though he had just ended Lane's life in the most brutal way possible. In the days that followed, Hunt was quick to try and deflect suspicion, but despite his attempts to hide his involvement, the evidence was already stacking up against him. His fingerprints and DNA were found at the scene, and a witness reported seeing him enter Lane's apartment just hours before the attack. The brutality of his actions and his failure to comprehend the magnitude of what he had done were apparent to everyone but him. As Hunt sat in his cell, facing the consequences of his actions, he would later express remorse in a way that still seemed disconnected from the depth of the violence he had inflicted. "I can't explain what happened. All I can say is that she didn't deserve what happened to her." But his words rang hollow, as his actions spoke louder than any apology could ever express. After the brutal murder of Karen Lane, Gregory Hunt quickly became the primary suspect. Evidence gathered from the scene, including Hunt's fingerprints and DNA, directly linked him to the crime. A witness had seen Hunt entering Lane's apartment earlier that night, and his own actions, from the phone call to the boyfriend of Lane's friend, were all pieces of the puzzle that led to his arrest. The trial, which took place in 1990, was a defining moment. Hunt was convicted of capital murder for the killing of Lane. The jury, after deliberating, voted 11-1 to recommend the death penalty. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the violence of the crime, the clear motive of jealousy and rage, and the testimonies from key witnesses all pointed to Hunt's guilt. Despite this, Hunt continued to maintain his innocence, filing multiple appeals in an attempt to overturn his conviction. He claimed that the autopsy findings were inaccurate, but his arguments were dismissed as lacking merit. His repeated attempts to delay his execution were denied, with the Alabama Attorney General's office firmly stating that Hunt had already exhausted his appeal process. After 35 long years on death row, Gregory Hunt's day of reckoning finally arrived. On June 10, 2025, he was led to the execution chamber at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, where he would face the consequences of his actions. This time, the method of execution was nitrogen hypoxia, a new and controversial method that had already been used in previous executions in Alabama. In the hours leading up to his execution, Hunt was given the opportunity for a last meal, a final request many inmates used to reflect on their last moments. However, in a striking move, Hunt chose to decline the last meal, an eerie decision that seemed to reflect his detachment from the gravity of his situation. Instead, he had a simple lunch tray, consisting of bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. It was a humble meal, a stark contrast to the intense emotions that surrounded the moment of his death. As the curtain in the viewing chamber lifted, Hunt was strapped to a gurney. He was calm, almost eerily so. He didn't speak, didn't make any final statements. Instead, he gave a thumbs up and even flashed what appeared to be a peace sign, a gesture that, to many, felt disconnected from the gravity of his past actions. At 5:54 p.m., the mask was placed over Hunt's face, and the nitrogen gas began to flow. For a few moments, Hunt's breathing grew labored, and his body began to twitch. His head lifted slightly from the gurney, then his feet raised as his body jerked. The watching witnesses could only watch in silence as Hunt struggled for breath, his body shaking involuntarily. The process wasn't swift. His body fought the gas as his limbs convulsed. By 6:05 p.m., Hunt's breathing had ceased. His body stilled. The finality of the moment settled over the chamber. The curtain was drawn, and at 6:26 p.m., the official time of death was declared. This was the end of Gregory Hunt's long journey, but for Lane's family, it was a bitter resolution. For them, it wasn't about closure. It was about seeing justice finally served, even if it didn't bring their loved one back. The pain of Karen Lane's violent death would never be erased, but in that moment, they knew her killer would never hurt anyone again. Gregory Hunt's execution marks the end of a long journey for justice, but for Lane's family, it was never about closure. The truth is, no execution could ever erase the pain of losing a loved one in such a violent, senseless manner. The execution served as a final step in a process that had stretched over decades. For the family, it was justice, but not healing. That's everything about Gregory Hunt case. Let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and may justice always prevail.